So, hello everyone. We'll be starting the session by Pranjalya now. As I have already told that he is an alumnus of IIT Indore and IIT Delhi. So he'll be, in fact, I had asked him to kind of give a title of today's talk, which he has not still given. So I'm hoping that he will guide us through the entire curriculum with some interesting observations from his side. However, everyone is welcome to interrupt him. I hope it's fine with you.
Yes, yes, definitely,
So
definitely.
interrupt you and let's keep it interactive. I know the troubles of doing a session online, so I'll be interactive. Don't worry. So let's see
Sure.
if others can join us in the conversation. Nikita, I'm very sure will have some questions to ask. So it's over to Pranjalya. I'll give you the host rights now. Fine.
Sure.
Okay, there you go.
Uh, so,
You can start sharing.
yeah, I hope you guys can
Yeah,
see my
yeah, yeah,
screen now.
yeah. It's visible.
Okay, cool. So, thank you, Dr. Krishna, for giving this opportunity to me for a quick interaction. And as you said, I have not shared the topic because the topic here are the smaller concerns, data
Mm.
science, the smaller concerns. We are not talking about the big problems and the big issues and the big uh, concepts. But what are the smaller concerns? I guess that takes some diving deep into. So when we think of data science, I think the two immediate observations around us in the world is the hype and the big problems. Now, when you look at the hype, it's how much money a data scientist makes, what are the solutions that data scientist is putting forward, how ML and AI is enabling all of us to be more responsive and forecasting and a lot of things. But then there are some big problems, big issues being discussed on big platforms, which is like, is data science replacing or MLAI replacing jobs for humans? Will AIs go rogue and they'll take over the civilization? Should machines be allowed to judge? Should machines be allowed to be placed in situations like self-driving cars, or then made then be making a judgment in a courtroom? So should machines be responsible for anything? But we are not addressing those problems. Those are for probably better minds to talk about. What we are talking are the smaller concerns. Now, some of the smaller concerns are like this. Microsoft had put a chatbot online in the initial days of MLA analysis, and the chatbot was named Tay. And when it was, as soon as it became online, it started analyzing a lot of data from Twitter. And because of all the feed that it was getting from a lot of users, it started making very sexist and racist comments online. So I guess, and immediately after that, Microsoft had to pull that down. Then there are other cases where Amazon tried to make a cognitive approach and analytics approach for their hiring, and they created a whole data set based on their history of the hiring they had, based on the profile of the members that they have hired, and how can a better decision be made by a machine to do the same, how to peruse through hundreds of resumes. But what they ended up finding was that actually it was making a big part of that decision was being based on the gender of the client or gender of the candidate. And that again was highlighted very much as a gender bias in ML models, a danger of ML models, what we don't immediately might see. Then there is this cool example where an AI gets to control the camera in an online live forecast, and rather than following the soccer ball, it starts following the head of the referee, and doesn't know the difference between or doesn't have no clue of the context it is supposed to capture. And then this is one of my most the favorite of all the memes. It actually came with a caption that everyone talks about AI taking all over the world, and then AI gives this classification where it says a fly to be dog. So I get these are the smaller concerns. These are the problems on the ground that probably we need to think about, and um, probably analyze why we can, or how we can at least avoid or alleviate some of them. Now, based on the curriculum that was given, and I'm supposing this is an introductory course to data science, so I'll be talking about the four major topics that were given in the curriculum: statistics for data science, supervised, unsupervised, and then visualization. And around those topics, I'll be talking about the applications, variants, challenges, some sections of each of these topics. What is the significance? What is their popularity and prevalence? And all about some kind of a practical overview, a directing kind of what we should expect from all these topics. So I'll start from statistics for data science. I guess data science is one of the very basic notions we should accept is the uncertainty. Now, when physicists accept uncertainty, they get quantum physics. When mathematicians accept uncertainty, they get statistics. So it's kind of the analysis of what is the uncertainty, how we can quantify the uncertainty. And this statistics forms the basic philosophy, the core of data science. It is, I read it somewhere that on Wikipedia, if you dive down sufficiently long enough on any page, you will end up on the philosophy page. Well, if there was a data science wiki, then that philosophy page would be statistics. Statistics gives the mathematical rigor for data science, the justification, why data science works, or why is it even why does it even make sense to study or use data science. It also formulates all the basic assumptions, almost all the basic assumptions of all the MLAI models, made then be for the Gaussian errors or then otherwise of feature independence, correlation. And these are also some of the most asked questions for interviews. So probably statistics is the most talked about and least appreciated component of data science. Now, this is not just at a theoretical level. Practically also in field also, I think data science has a lot of dependence on statistics. If you look into one of the popular libraries of analytics, which is Pandas, PDescribe happens to be one of the most used compound operation, and all it does is gives you a basic stats of a lot of all the columns: mean, median, mode, percentile values. So people are referring to statistics in data science almost every day. And this data science also helps us capture the data signature. Given the data is huge, there are thousands and crores of rows. There is no way or no manual way to summarize them besides statistics. Besides using the statistics of the data, there is no other way for us to interpret or identify or kind of create a footprint of this data. It also adds a sense of interpretability. When you actually tend to deploy these solutions in the market or in business, this component of statistics is what helps us sell this solution, helps us convince the client that yes, this is what you're looking for. So under this whole contribution,
sorry,
yeah,
just
sure.
an observation. If you go to your back, if you go to your slide backward, no, what I wanted to add is, if physicists accept uncertainty, you will get quantum physics. Continuing the same thing, if I think humans accept uncertainty, they get married.
Maybe that is very true.
Are you married?
No, not yet.
So you will not understand this. So when humans kind of they reach a stage where they are ready to accept uncertainty, they get married.
Well, I have studied a bit about quantum physics and I know a bit about statistics. So I guess the next uncertainty would be that.
Yeah. Let's go forward.
Yeah. So when we say statistics has a lot of contribution data science, I'll talk here mostly about the four immediate applications that we can see. One is some explicit modeling. Statistics gives us a lot of explicit models that we use in data science. It helps us a lot in the pre-processing. It helps us a lot in measuring the performance of the models that we create, and it also helps us in maintaining the models. Now, when we talk about modeling, statistics is full of parameterized that are governed by a few parameters. And because they have been studied for a long time, a lot of interpretation is available around them, a lot of ways to quantify them and analyze and present and draw inferences from them is already available. And these solutions happen to be very scalable if they are appropriately applicable. That is definitely a note there, that if a statistical model is applicable in the field, that is the only way to go. Now, what I've shown here is a Wilbur distribution, which is very often used as a model for decay of any kind of asset. I have recently used, and this is just one application. I have just put it on health of a pole in the field, and the data for the asset was being captured using some IoT sensors that were capturing the vibrations of the pole, and we then modeled the decay of the pole, the health decay of the pole using this distribution. So I guess this is one of many immediate applications that explicit modeling applications that statistics has in data science. If we talk about pre-processing, obviously, as we saw earlier, Amazon had created a system that was clearly discriminating among men and women while selecting them for interviews. This was probably due to the data imbalance, how the gender, because of their previous selections, it might have happened that the people who were hiring might have had some bias, and that is why maybe 70 to 80% of their hiring had already been men, which is exactly what the model got. So when it started learning, it learned that probably men are better at doing the job that Amazon requires than women, which definitely is not true. But that is what the model learns, and it cannot discriminate on its own regarding which is a relevant feature and which is just happen to be an outcome of the imbalance of the data set. So I guess statistics is always the first step that we do. We calculate the imbalance in all the features that we are going to consider. Then we also try to find out the feature selection using the independence and the importance of those features with respect to whatever we are trying to achieve. Then a big part of pre-processing is data cleaning, and this is actually very frustrating at times because we might not be very sure where the noise is coming from or how to model that particular noise. But if there is any way to actually model them, it is definitely through one or the other statistical measure using mean, median, mode, all those metrics that we studied long back. All those come very handy in finding out the outliers, removing the noise, scaling the data, minimization, standardization. All those things happen almost for every model development that we do. Then when we talk about performance metrics, probably the only way to present the error or analyze the error are through statistics of the errors. And as I had said before also that while statistics place some constraints on the errors for the model to be valid, the performance of the model also gets judged from what the stats of the errors are. May then be p-value, k-value, which are, so p-value comes from the hypothesis testing, which is a very prevalent form of doing analytics, especially in the advanced analytics or the structured data analysis that we see. Kappa score is good for, or K score here is good for categorical data set that we use. And then there is this concept of confidence interval, which is highly exploited in while presenting results for time series data. I think you can, the image that I've shown here is actually trying to show the confidence interval of the forecast that we are making. And then model maintenance. So when we are actually deploying the models or the solutions in the field, we have to create a pipeline, a structure that maintains and continuously monitors the performance. Now that performance can be monitored at multiple levels. There may be checks on the input data distribution itself. So when you make the model, you might have taken a data in a particular, I guess, distribution or with a particular mean, variance, standard deviation. And then when you actually deploy it over time, the data starts changing its distribution. So there, by keeping a check, by monitoring the statistics of the data, we can kind of trigger when a retraining of the model is required. Also, as might be implicitly visible here, that we can actually just put triggers on the model performance as the model performance starts to drop down. Probably it's the time for retraining the model with the new incoming data. So I guess these are 4 very prevalent bullet points where statistics has huge contribution when we talk about data science. Now moving on to supervised learning, I guess overview we all might have. We have a set of inputs and then We know a set of outputs. Now what we want to find is the relationship between the input and the output, a pattern that can help us take these inputs to the correct output. And most of the problems that we see will be supervised, at least in the business. Why? Because whenever a problem is brought to us, to the consultants of the data science, or to any company who is trying to provide a solution, data science solution, then the problem has to be well defined from the client's perspective. Obviously, the consultants help define the problem, but before the project starts, people try and define the problem very well, which is why most of the times we have some idea of what the input would be and what the output would be, which effectively converts it to a supervised learning task. Also, in many cases, we see the champion challenger scenario where the client has already implemented some form of the analytics and probably is not happy or wants to see what better is out there. So they would already have a full pipeline of this is the input, this is the pre-processing we have done, and this is the results that we are getting. How can you improve on this? What do you have up your sleeve? Supervised learning task obviously immediately can be considered into either classification or regression. And some of the domains that probably have classification heavy problems or more classification problems would be medical solutions, insurance services, automated response systems, which is also kind of uh, picking up pace here, where when you see doing chatbots, giving automated chatbots on almost every website, what they're trying to do is just find the context of a statement and then reply accordingly. So essentially all they are doing is you give them a statement, either they do just a keyword search or they might classify this a particular query or a particular statement into one of the categories that they already have, and correspondingly give the correct response based on that. Now, if you look at the regression problems, which is kind of the problems where you actually get to predict a continuous set of values, financial analytics is probably one of the most contributing domain that gives a lot of regression problems to us. Resource optimization, load estimation, and then automated automated response systems. I think I've repeated here, but it was not supposed to be here. So yeah, I guess this regression heavy, we have financial analytics and resource optimization. Now, another way that we should, or another set of classifications that we should probably look at is the types of data that we have. Although the classification of structured and unstructured data has nothing to do with supervised learning, but as I said, most of the problems we'll face will be supervised. It's probably good to look into this classification in the context of supervised learning also. So when we look at the structured data, we are talking mostly about the tabular form of data. And in industry, these are the real bread earners, because almost all the analytics, or a good amount of analytics that is being done, is on some form of data that has been collected over years and has been very well defined and tabulated. It could be time series data or records of failure events, or maybe the success or the sales of a particular type of product. All those data sets come under the structured data, where you have specific column headings, specific values at each row, and a good amount of those problems can be effectively solved using the basic ML techniques. When we talk about the basic ML techniques, it could be any sort of linear regressor, it could be your random forest decision trees, and other ML techniques of that sort. But on the other hand, we would have unstructured data that might include image, audio, video, and we do get a lot of requests or questions or tasks corresponding to that. Recently, there was some task of trying to identify the damage to a particular asset based on the image of the asset, and how can we assign a value to the insurance that should be reimbursed for that particular damage. So that kind of image or audio or video analytics comes under unstructured data, and deep learning techniques are probably more successful in those scenarios, and they often tend to be,
Yeah, maybe I can also put in a few examples. So
yeah.
like an example where I worked on unstructured data was in video analytics. So we were trying to identify if a driver was wearing his seatbelt or not. So we had the label. So it was again supervised learning because we know whether the driver is wearing a seatbelt or not, right? So we label all of them and then we figure out whether he's wearing the seatbelt or not. So this is again something that we do in like video analytics. So at least for us, a large number of problems that we get are related to video or image. I guess that there's a lot of demand for this.
Yeah.
And maybe for structured data, an example we could give is like that COVID prediction that we were doing. So we had a lot of data about COVID, and then we were trying to just predict how much COVID would be, like how many cases we would have in the future. So that also we were using basic ML techniques and trying to just predict it in the future. So that would be like kind of structured because we have an idea of exactly what it is.
Yes, those actually pretty well fitted into everything that I'd written here. So I guess good examples.
Nikita, was it matching symptoms to whether there is COVID or not, kind of thing?
No, sir. Actually, we were trying to like take patterns from countries that are not like other countries that have already seen a peak. And then we were trying to see if like India would reach its peak soon or if India is already at its peak and then when we would peak next. To predict how many cases we have. That's it, just by seeing older cases and cases from other countries.
Okay. So kind of regression modeling, is it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could call it that, yes, but like we were just forecasting, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, sure. So I guess this is just a site classification that we have here, descriptive and diagnostic. These are pretty well explored, and they typically talk about that has already happened. So what has happened in the past and why it has happened. And explainability is the main key concern in such tasks at hand. They are typically solved using various forms of visualization of the data that we already have, multiple stats that are being presented, and how they explain a particular outcome. But then I guess a core or a bulk of the data science that anyone might be doing would either lie in predictive or prescriptive. So you will have, as Nikita gave the example of trying to find the number of cases. So that falls under the predictive kind of task that we'll have, where you already have a past history of cases and you're trying to predict what would happen in the near future and how probably you can prepare for it. And then there are other tasks that are prescriptive. So what Amazon does these days of recommending, that comes out of some sort of prescriptive model, which tries to prescribe a certain set of steps that might impact or change the scenario in the way that you want it to. You want to increase the sales, you try prescribing these outputs, you try showing these results to the user, and probably he'll buy them. So that falls under the prescriptive domains of problems that we have.
Yeah, I think also one example is it's the example in the syllabus as well. The very common example of people who are buying bread and egg are most likely to buy butter, maybe something like that. So that's also one example of suggesting that they buy butter because you see that they are buying bread and eggs.
Yeah, I have a take on this. I often say this is a very awful example of prediction.
Yeah.
What is more
I
interesting
remember.
prediction is if somebody buys bread and butter, no, not bread and butter, let's say beer and diapers, that will be very interesting. Buying beer also buys diaper. So, because if he only buys beer, you would classify him as irresponsible person. But if he also buys diapers, then how do you classify him? So if somebody comes up with such observation, that would be more interesting. Bread and butter is like not so very, I mean, given.
Yeah. I guess bread and butter, because we can immediately see there is little appreciation for that. But yeah, if someone tells me that a guy who buys beer also buys diapers, or whenever he comes to buy diapers, he's buying beer for himself, definitely that's an interesting observation that we might overlook, and which such algorithms are supposed to figure out.
Yes.
Now, if we talk a bit about unsupervised learning, as I said, although most of the problems that we'll have are in some form of the other a supervised learning task, but unsupervised learning in itself, just one line definition, no target label. That's it, nothing else. There is no, I guess, there is an estimation of distribution connotation to it, and trying to find out meaningful clusters and all. But essentially what they are trying to say, or the basic constraint is there is no target label. And in many cases, it's an augmenting exercise to a supervised learning task. So suppose that in one of the recent works that I was doing, we had the task of trying to forecast the sales for a FMCG company, and they have a huge range of products and a huge, large geography to cover. So that gives us a large number of observations over a period of say last 5 years for a lot of categories or products or geographies. And it almost becomes manually impossible to make a model for each of them, right? So in such cases, what you would typically do is try and cluster those individual products and a particular geography. You would try to find a similarity of maybe sales of one geography with the other, so that you can club the data for both of them together and make a single model for all of them. So more often than not, the unsupervised learning techniques kind of form an augmenting exercise that is done before solving the actual task using a supervised learning algorithm. And this this is not to say that there is some less importance of supervised learning, because it is this clustering or this grouping that will actually boost the accuracy or make the solution even viable or useful in the field. And definitely, that is probably the only way that we can actually scale such solutions. Now, then, as another point I've put here is creating representative data sets. This is also something that we have used recently. So at times we'll have very huge amount of data, and it becomes very difficult to even generate statistics for that and observe the same. Like if you have some 100 columns and you're trying to see the correlation, it almost becomes impossible. So unsupervised learning at times also helps us get a representative data set. Suppose you have a data set with 2 crore entries. What you can rather end up doing is create 10,000 clusters. Each cluster might have some number of entries, and take the cluster center as your data set. So now you have a sub data set of say 10,000 samples. You can do all your analytics on that. And then when you are satisfied that this particular solution works, you can apply that on the complete data set and take all the time for that as you need. Then there are also some specialized problems that are only solved through unsupervised learning. There might be contact tracing and customer grouping, as sir was just mentioning, that there is trying to group the users together. So in the past, a guy has bought beer and diapers together, and then in the future a guy comes and he's buying diapers. Definitely they place the beer next to the counter so that he sees that and buys that. So that is the kind of customer grouping that we are trying to do, grouping the customers whose purchase patterns are similar. They try to group them together and recommend one based on the patterns of the other. Then also there are spam and fraud detection. These clustering unsupervised techniques tend to perform pretty well in spam and fraud detection techniques, fraud detection tasks, especially because when you are trying to detect fraud, you mostly might not have a very good or very well labeled data. If you're trying to look at your emails, obviously you would have to make someone sit and probably label hundreds of emails before you can actually have a labeled data set. So in such cases, I guess clustering comes to the aid, where it just clusters the data set. The meaning is up to you. It's up to you to derive the meaning. And I think that is one of the challenges also with the unsupervised learning techniques. So the 3 challenges that I have shown here are creating efficient features. What sort of features will actually give you relevant information or relevant clustering behavior for the problem that you are considering? So suppose that, for example, that I was giving earlier, you have say 5,000 time series in the same duration. What features do you calculate for each of those time series so that you can cluster them together effectively? This is the kind of questions that you might end up answering when you are trying to apply unsupervised learning in the field. Then selecting the cluster depth. It is very important to select the right cluster depth for the clusters to make sense, and obviously interpreting the clusters. You can see here, this is an image from one of the papers that I was referring earlier. And what is shown here is a set of images. They have extracted some image object detection features using, I guess, VGG16 or something. And then on that, they have applied a clustering algorithm that is the actual substance of the paper. Now, this is actually a hyperparameter based clustering. So what they are trying to show here is, for a particular value of that hyperparameter, what are the clusters, and each row here is a cluster as detected by the algorithm. Now you can see, even though there are clusters, there are two clusters, separate clusters for motorcycles, and they are typically different because there is a difference in the background. Then there is a cluster for t-shirts, there is a cluster for human faces, and there are two clusters for airplanes. One is the set of airplanes on ground, and another is the set of airplanes in the sky. So this is all the question of how deep you want the clusters to go. Probably a more meaningful clustering would have been where the bikes were in the same cluster. So these are the type of questions you might end up wanting to answer. And even because this was a clustering over image dataset, it was probably easy to see the clusters. When you look at the structured problems where you only have numbers, it becomes very difficult. And then probably the only ways would be the statistical measures of performance of the clustering that we are using. Now, if you talk about some popular algorithms, k-means, DB-scan, and hierarchical are very popular. And GMM, DPGMM are very promising in terms of their potential of clustering. So GMM happens to be a variant over k-means, and then DPGMM is a variant over GMM. So these sort of algorithms probably not very well adapted, but they have a lot of promise, I feel, and this feeling is based on some very intelligent people. So yeah. And then, as I said, in the structured data, we would have only numbers. So I guess the cluster inertia and the Silhouette coefficient, these metrics like this, which are the statistical measures of interdistance between clusters and the intra-distance of the clusters. So I guess these metrics then help us try and decode. They are not in any way a measure of how good a cluster is. They are just a way to relatively place the clusters or the clustering effort in a sequence. And then you can choose. So at the end, it will lie up to you only to choose which clustering level you want. Yeah. I guess that's pretty much.
Yeah, you have covered
about
covered most of the syllabus.
Yeah. This is just we are talking about what probably you should be looking out for the each of the topic. And then if you talk about visualization, it is always a big component of model explainability. It is I've put these graphics as an example of why and how it might make difference. You have a correlation set of figures here and then corresponding heat map. Heat map might make immediate sense to you, that these numbers wouldn't. Then I've shown a line visualization, that is a way to kind of see how random forest and other classification algorithms are working. And it gives a pretty, I would say, prescriptive approach to giving the prediction. You also see a clustergram. This is a way of representing what sort of features have which values in which cluster. So when you have very high dimensionality, if you have a two-dimensional data, you can very easily see the clusters. But for more than that, you have to become a bit creative. And I guess in visualization, it's mostly about awareness. So almost always there is a very specific and very efficient way of presenting the data in the task that you are handling. And if you are able to find that, there's no better justification that you can give for that task that you have accomplished. So I guess in conclusion, I have a couple of checks that I like to do, and I guess people would definitely be doing. So probably the first check is for the problem to make intuitive sense, right? If the problem is not immediately doesn't appear to be something that you might have some idea of solving, or if it doesn't make sense that how a particular thing might ever give this outcome, then probably the algorithm that you're trying to implement will also not do it. And there has to be logical consistency. If in a particular flow, at times when we move into deep learning, things become so abstract that we end up changing a lot of figures and not knowing really what we are changing and what impact it might have. But then I think those are the places where we really need to have the logical consistency, the justification for each step that we are kind of taking. Tuning and all is fine, but or trying to do a hit and trial and a random and grid search is fine, but you have to have some sort of justification of why you are moving in a particular direction. Then probably the second check is whether you have a good business understanding of the problem, right? What is the actual outcome that is required, how the outcome will translate into the solution that is being asked for, and the subject matter awareness. Do we have enough information about the thing that we are trying to solve? And the third check, this is obviously right before probably you are starting to develop the model, or even while developing the model, is comprehensive problem definition. You have to very well define even before you start. You can't have loose ends in the definition, because even though this is a fuzzy approach to solving problems, the problem cannot itself be fuzzy. Problem has to be very concrete. Then there are cases of data leak. So this is actually a big like, you would think it is not such a big problem, but it is more often than not the cause of many misquotes of accuracies and errors. So more often than not, what we are training for includes some of the information from on the data set that we are testing on, and that ends up being a disaster, because you have already trained on something, and that is exactly what you're presenting the accuracies on. So that kind of data leak, that kind of information leak, you have to be very, very cautious about. You might be doing some pre-processing tasks on the entire data, which is kind of bringing the statistics of the test in the train. But what you're supposed to do is only work on the train and get whatever you can from that, and then try and apply on the test, and then report the accuracies. So that kind of data leak is very prevalent and often the cause of a lot of misreporting of accuracy. And then obviously contextual caution. So there might be a lot of measures that we see, that we present, like one of the ways that so accuracy is something that we all very intuitively understand as a in a language, also in everyday conversation also. So when we talk about accuracy, and if we have a regression problem, there is no direct way that we can actually find something corresponding to accuracy. So accuracy would be how many times are you correct. Now, if I am to predict the sales, and if the sales was say 500, I have predicted 520, I don't know how many times I was correct, right? Maybe I can say how much I was correct, and that is exactly what is called accuracy in such cases. You try to find the percentage error and then subtract it from 100, right? And then try to show that as accuracy. But that has to be a very with a very strong contextual caution, because at times your MAPE will go, or your percentage errors will go above 100, and that will give you negative accuracies. And that becomes very difficult to justify. Why do we have minus 13 accuracy? What does that mean? So you can understand 100% accuracy, you can understand 0% accuracy, but minus 13% accuracy makes no sense, right? So I guess some sort of contextual caution also should be there in almost all the activities that we are doing. Yeah, so that is I guess all that I had.
Can I
And
add an example? You can
yeah,
go
sure.
back to yeah. So I have a really funny example actually for data leak. So in the same project where I was doing the seatbelt identification, we were doing whether the driver is smoking or not. So the entire project was to identify safe driving or unsafe driving scenarios. So what we had done is we had like separated the every frame into either smoking or not smoking. But then what my colleague had done is she had done a shuffle and she trained the model. But because we had majority samples of smoking in our test set, we thought that it was working perfectly. But then we realized that it was just always predicting that the person is smoking. And just because we didn't realize that there was that one data leak of just shuffling, it's just one simple line that you won't even realize that you're shuffling. So that one shuffle caused the entire model to fail, and we didn't realize that we were having a data leak. So that's why the models were not able to classify exactly. So like this thing is actually very important, because every single step would be perfect, but that one data leak could cause the entire classification to go wrong. So this is
Yeah,
actually a really nice point. We didn't realize this until like the last step.
yeah. And almost always the real world problems or real world samples will immediately bring you down to the ground. So there was this interesting case where people had this medical application of trying to detect whether there is air bubble in the heart. So they have some ECG images for that, and the way they had labeled it is they try and poke the heart with some tube, and if it comes positive, then that is a image with a heart or a air bubble. and then there are other images that they are very sure that it doesn't have a bubble, so they don't even poke it. They just set it as a false or a wrong or a no air bubble case. So the data set now has two sets of images, one that has air bubbles labeled as yes, and other that has no bubbles labeled as no. When the model was trained, the model started classifying it at a 99% accuracy. It was brilliant at finding out whether there is an air bubble or not. But when it was actually applied, it started giving accuracy close to 50%. So it was essentially not predicting anything. It was just giving random guesses. It was later found out, because it's very difficult, and this was a deep learning approach, and it's very difficult to actually see what's happening in between the layers. So using the concept of kernel images and all, people tried to actually see what is being learned in the layer. And they found out that what the model has actually learned is to figure out if there is a tube in the image, because only the heart images that actually had an air bubble had a testing tube. So all it was doing was detecting the tube, and if it found a tube, it would say yes. If it didn't find a tube, it would say no, which would work perfectly on your entire train and test, but still would fail in the real world. Yeah.
Oh.
So I guess that's all I had for the discussion here, and we can
Yeah,
take
but
this ahead wherever.
the coverage that you have done is excellent. Let me see if some guys are actually awake and they are actually listening. Let us see. If somebody is actually out there and has heard, he can ask questions so that we know that you are actually there. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to know whether you are actually there or not. Is anybody out there who wants to have an interaction with Pranjalya and Nikita?
Yeah, hi, sir, Madhir.
Yeah, Anirudh, go ahead.
I wanted to ask about the clustering methods. Like, I don't get what kind of metrics do you use for whether the two clusters are, that is correctly classified or not? Because a lot of times, like while doing clustering, the two classes may be highly correlated or like overlapping. So, how do you try to look at that?
Yeah, so that is true. Clustering has no perfect way of quantifying if you have a good cluster. At the end of the day, it will always be a question of how well do you understand the problem, how well you can you interpret those clusters. But some of the metrics that people use would be things like inertia, like the total distance between all the samples. So a popular method of doing cluster selection in k-means is the elbow method, right? So where all they do is try to find the distance between the samples of a particular cluster, right? And when that distribution becomes, or when that change in the overall inertia or overall sum of the errors or some of the distances stops decreasing very much, that is where the perfect cluster separation lies. This is just a view from the common sense understanding. So it's also, I probably should have said this about unsupervised learning, but most of the concepts in unsupervised learning are very intuitive and very based on common sense understanding of the data, because at the end of the day, it is just estimation of distribution, how everything is distributed, what things are close to each other, what things are far, and how far do you consider the distance, or how far something has to be before you consider them different, right? So a lot of things here are based on the common
problem
sense
definitions.
Yeah, problem definition. At the end of the day, you will not have a single metric that gives you the perfect answer. Okay, if this value is less than 0.5, I say 3 clusters. If it is greater than 0.5, I say 4. No, there is nothing like that.
Okay.
Yeah, to add to what Pranjala has said, in fact, for unsupervised learning, the certain metrics are there. In fact, even for clustering, there is very popular, apart from elbow method, there is also an index called Duns index, which is often used to find the efficiency of clustering. But again, since it's unsupervised, there is no way to actually measure. There is no benchmark against which you can measure.
Correct.
That's
Correct.
always a problem. Right. Anyone else? Thank you, Anirudh. Anyone else? Finally, it is me and you, I guess.
Yeah.
That always happens. Fine. If you have any question, you can please ask now. Nikita has fresh memory of being student, so she can understand the plight of students better. But I think that that's always the case. Even I think Pranjali also knows that as students, it's rather difficult for them to interact. And I think this online medium somehow has made the life easy for students. They can
Yeah,
safely listen and hear, but stay behind this digital burqa thing has made our life very difficult. Otherwise, you can point and ask, "Hey, you there in second bench, third person, ask the question." So here we
yeah,
can't do that. Finally, if you tend to force them, they will say, "My mic has a problem." That is what they will finally land.
yeah,
It's very difficult for us. But anyway, it was very good, Pranjali. Before we go any further, I was tempted from the beginning to ask the meaning of your name and to say
yeah,
something regarding that. I hope you have heard this from almost everyone who has heard your name.
yeah. I have a good answer to that. I am always asked that, and I
Please,
have a good answer to that.
please go ahead
So
because
the
I have
name,
something to add.
yeah,
So,
yeah. So the story that goes that I know at least about my name is so this name comes from one of the words in that is mentioned in Mahabharat, and it's apparently a combination of the two words Pran and Anjali. So Anjali means the palm of your hand, or this action effectively,
yeah,
and then Pran is all your the symbolic of all your deeds. So when there is this person, I'm not sure who, probably Arjun maybe, he's offering all his deeds in his palm, all his activities, all everything he's offering to Krishna, and that is the act of pranjalyam, and giving everything in your palms, all your deeds to Krishna. So
yeah.
that is the story that I know, and that is the story that my uncle has told, who has actually given me this name.
Yeah. Very interesting story. Actually, this name is very interesting mainly because of two reasons. You mentioned Mahabharata. I'm a lifelong student of Ramayana, so I can't. I'm always tempted to connect everything back to Ramayana. So
Hmm.
this name also has a resonance in Ramayana.
Hmm.
Uh, Anjaneya or Hanumanta is also called as Pranjalya. There is in fact a full shloka where he is called as Pranjalya,
Hmm.
where the Sanskrit meaning you have told in Sanskrita, the advantage is that you can break the words in multiple ways. One is the right way that you have told, Pran plus Anjali. Anjali also means offering, it also means the blessing taken by someone. The one
Hmm.
more way of breaking this is the meaning will come out as somebody with whose eyes are always filled with water, that
Hmm.
is, who is teary eyed. So it
Hmm.
seems Anjaneya was always filled with tears whenever he saw Sri Ram, with the
Hmm.
devotion and other things. So he is called Pranjalya. Somebody who is clean in his heart always will have teary eyes, Santa. So all the things which comes out of his, all the all the things which he wanted to say was coming through his eyes, Santa. So he was teary eyed whenever he saw Sri Ram. So he is also called Pranjalya. So that offering story, there is in fact this there is one more story in Mahabharata itself about Anjali and Pran where a fish comes into the bowl and the whole story of Mahabharata starts. But you
Hmm.
have been given a very interesting name, Pranjali. Be proud about that.
Thank you. Thank
So
you.
there is a question in the chat box. What was that?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can talk about one project actually.
Yeah.
So actually Pranjalia gave me this project. I had just joined. I didn't have much work. So to one project that he had asked me to do was actually very fun for me. It was he asked me to generate time and then generate clocks out of all of the time. So just basically create every single time that's possible through numbers and then create images of clocks. So like create a circle and create like the lines of the clock. And then using these labels, feed it to a machine learning model so that it will tell you what the time is,
Okay.
right? So this was one fun project for me just to get an idea of the entire thing. This was really fun. So if anybody wants to start off, I think you can pick that project up. It's quite understandable and not very complicated.
Yeah, I think largely, if you are asking this from an industry perspective, that also depends on what domain the industry is working on and what their current priorities are. So, if you go to a company where they are working on multiple projects at a time, so you may get a good head start to begin with. But for a company which has started, which has a small setup to begin with, the kind of problems that you may encounter as a beginner in this particular field of data science may be different. So if you are working in a commercial organization, then the priorities of the organization will determine what kind of project you will get to start with. I think, yeah. If there is no more questions, we'll have to close because, yeah. Okay, he wants to listen to all the personal stories.
Yeah, Ashish, maybe the example that I gave was personal learning itself,
Yeah.
but
Some
maybe
of
Pranjalya might have some interesting example.
Yeah, I guess when we were being given initially, we were just exposed to this UCI learning repository, so UCI dataset repository, and we were told that this is probably the most curated form of data that you'll ever get, with a lot of interpretation also around it. And my work when I was in masters, when I was doing masters, was typically around unsupervised learning. So I had actually done a lot of clustering exercises from there and picking up various data sets, different algorithms. So I would say at a personal level, I've just explored a lot of data sets there. And the good thing about there is they have a lot of synthetic data sets as well as a lot of real data sets that you can apply whatever algorithm you want on. And they also suggest a corresponding best way to model that, or probably multiple ways to you want to frame that. It could be a clustering problem, it could be a supervised regression problem. So I guess that is one stop that I used initially very much. Obviously, people talk a lot about the projects on Kaggle. So there is also that. But yeah, I had personally used that.
Yeah, so
Sure.
I think I will have to close the session because
Yeah.
the time is up. So thank you very much, Pranjalya. This was, I think, a good beginning for our series of talks, which I intend to have in this course from the people who practice the craft in the industry. And thank you, Nikita, for getting us connected with Pranjalya. We hope that you will come up with many more uh, references for us for this
Yeah.
course, and we'll be in constant touch later also, Pranjalya, because in this course also there are some teams formed and they are working on some data sets,
Hmm.
and they are working on something which is going on. Maybe in next 15 to 20 days, most of them would reach a decent stage where we can start presenting them to the outside world. At that time, you will surely come in as one of the observers of the kind of work that the students have done, to give them some kind of inputs on what they have done and where they can carry this forward. Most of them, as you have rightly observed, are working on Kaggle data sets. Though it was not mandatory, I had given them an option of choosing the data set from whatever source. But they're applying all this to a particular data set. I am very positive about the kind of work they are doing, that I should put it on record, because I've been trying to do this for a while, but I think this online scenario has made them to work. So away from the distraction of the regular class, maybe that is one of the reasons. But we will surely involve you in the evaluation process later on this particular task, right?
Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Dr. Krishna.
yeah. It was a. I think the guys may not have responded, but I think it's very much understandable. But they would have observed it very carefully. Later, I'll just interact with them to get a sense of how they received it, and I'll definitely get back to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Then have a nice day. Let's close.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, sir. Have a nice
Bye.
day.
Yeah. Bye.